Nuket Varlik is Associate Professor of History at Rutgers University Newark and the University of South Carolina. She's a historian of the Ottoman Empire, interested in disease, medicine, and public health. She's the author of Plague and Empire in the Early Modern Mediterranean World, The Ottoman Experience, 1347 to 1600, and the editor of Plague and Contagion in the Islamic Mediterranean. Her new book project, Empire, Ecology, and Plague, Rethinking the Second Pandemic, circa 1340s to circa 1940s, examines the 600-year Ottoman plague experience in a global ecological context. In conjunction with this research, she is involved in developing the Black Death Digital Archive and contributing to multidisciplinary research projects that incorporate perspectives from paleogenetics, ancient DNA research in particular, bioarchaeology, disease ecology, and climate science into historical inquiry. She's the editor of the journal, the Ottoman and Turkish Studies Association. And if you are not aware of this journal and you're interested in Middle Eastern and specifically Ottoman and Turkish history, this is a really wonderful journal. I highly recommend you check it out. So please, let's welcome Professor Nuket Varlik. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you. Thank you for this introduction, and thank you everyone for joining us today. It's wonderful to be able to share my insights, my research, but at the same time, my insights that have been developing over the last couple of months during the COVID-19 pandemic. The news are changing every day, and there are new news coming and new information coming in. It just forces us to think and rethink the pandemic, just the current pandemic as well as past pandemics, because as a historian of plague and pandemics, I've been, of course, very following the pandemic very closely since the beginning, but at the same time, it's an opportunity for me to rethink my own research and raise new questions. And it's wonderful that you already set up this discussion today around the theme of narratives. Why do historical narratives matter? How do we narratives, and how do they come into play as we think about the present and as we rethink the past? So in my research, I try to emphasize the between the past and present. Let's first of all, before we start, let's just make a few observations about how we think about the past and the present and why they're connected, especially now that we are living in a pandemic. And this pandemic, for most of us, is the first time we're experiencing an event like this. And so it's perhaps just obvious that people now look back at history trying to understand the past pandemics either to find comfort or to develop an understanding or just to actually see how things happen, right? So around which, I guess, we are constantly in the process of building and restructuring, revising, tweaking the narratives we already have. So one thing we can say in conjunction to this is, why does past matter for the present? And why is present important for the past? And so one obvious observation I can make about this is that, well, first of all, let's not think about the past as something static. Past is not something that just happened and over with, right? Past is constantly in the process of construction. I want to think of the past as a construction site, right? It's something that we build and revise constantly, of course, as historians, as we rethink it. And how do we rethink it? Well, in the light of our present experiences. So in that respect, as a historian of pandemics, this pandemic is now letting me ask new questions to the past and to rethink and to restructure. So I just wanted to, make my thinking about this past-present relationship clear just as we start. And so around the question of narratives, and of course this program is focused on two areas, Middle East and Latin America, and I think there is something to be said about past plagues. Of course, other pandemics and other epidemic diseases also come into play in that context, but in particular, because I'm going to talk about plague today, about the experiences of those two regions and how they have been instrumental in shaping the narratives that we still think and we still use today. And so I will focus on the Middle East in particular because that's what my research is on. But I will also try to make connections to Latin America and see, how we can bring that into conversation. So very quickly before we start, as I said, I will talk about the notion of narratives and we'll try to build on that. But I also want to talk about the notion of legacy, right? The legacies that these past pandemics leave behind, and narratives are part of that legacy, but there is more to be said in terms of the legacy of past pandemics. So in terms of legacy, what do I mean? What do I have in mind? The biological legacy of a pandemic. What does it leave behind in changing our organisms in a way that we respond to a pandemic, biologically speaking, and how that leaves a legacy behind? And there's very new, exciting research that just came out actually about a week ago. So I'd like to talk a little bit about that. But in terms of social, political, cultural legacies, right, of pandemics and the narratives that we will talk about, again, one part of that legacy, but I would like to expand that notion of the legacy of past pandemics. So now let's start with the basics. And I would like to talk very briefly about the biology of plague, because it's important, just as it is important today to understand the biology of the coronavirus, right? I mean, if we don't know what COVID-19 is, if we don't know how the virus works, if we don't know how it is transmitted, then we cannot understand how, what we should do about it, how we should develop our policies about. So it's very important that we understand the biology of the disease. It's a given, it's a basic. I am one of those historians who actually take the biology of the disease very seriously, because it's also possible to say, well, I'm a historian, I'm only interested in the human experience of disease and how societies understand the disease, what they wrote about, like what the the historical actors did. And you can say, well, the biology of the disease is not something I'm interested in. And again, this is okay. There are some historians who do that. But in a way, by doing this, I have a feeling we're missing part of the picture, because there is crucial information that we can incorporate to our historical thinking if we understand the biology of the disease, right? And again, I want to quickly jump to the present day and remind you of this ongoing and unfolding discussions about the transmission of COVID, right? Now, let's start a few months ago. Let's start thinking about what the guidelines of WHO and CDC was about, how to protect us. There was more emphasis on hand washing, for example. And why? Because there was more emphasis on surface transmission. Now there is discussion about the virus, the possibility of it being airborne, and perhaps, we don't know yet, but there will be more emphasis on airborne transmission and perhaps less emphasis on surface transmission. Why does this matter? Because as we know more about the biology of the disease, as we understand its transmission mechanisms better, we can protect ourselves better, right? But these things are also, they are reflected on the social and cultural end of things. So they're reflected on the public health policy. They are reflected on what we think about the disease, how we fear it, right? Our emotions, our thoughts. So the social and cultural aspects are also, I believe, very closely related to the biology of disease. Okay, that said, I was just trying to justify why it's important to think about the biology of disease. I hope I convince you. So about plague, very briefly, plague is very different from COVID. Why? Because COVID is a viral disease, is caused by a virus, right? And it's transmitted from person to person. But plague is not a contagious disease in that sense, because it's not something that is transmitted under normal circumstances from person to person. plague is caused by a bacterium. So it's a bacterial infection, not viral infection. It is caused by this bacterium called Ursinia Pestis. It's a bacterium that was first isolated in the year 1894 by a French bacteriologist by the name of Alexander Yersin in Hong Kong during the third pandemic, which I'll talk about in a minute. So the virus was, the bacterium Ursinia Pestis is now known, how it behaves, its biological properties is now well known. And at the same time, after 1950s or so, since antibiotics became common, it can be treated. So it is not a disease that constitutes an immense public health threat today for the world, though occasionally it occurs in certain parts of the day. And for those of you, if you are following the news, there actually has been a few cases of plague reported from Inner Mongolia, from China in the last couple of weeks. In any case, so there is still plague in certain parts of the world. And I thought I had the map here, but I don't. In any case, yeah. So, okay. So it's a bacterial infection. It is not transmitted from person to person. And it still continues in certain parts of the way and of the world. And another thing to remember about plague is that it is not primarily a human disease. It is a disease of rodents, rats, and other rodents. And it is, under normal circumstances, it is not something that attacks humans. It's, it attacks mammals. Over more than 200 species of mammals are susceptible to disease. Cats, dogs, camels, rats, all sorts of small mammals. So a number of animals can be infected by this bacterium. And of course, this includes humans. But it's not primarily a human disease. And what this means is that if this disease is occurring naturally in the natural environment, and again, primarily among wild rodents, and if you don't get into contact with those animals, there is really no risk of getting the plague. But the news, again, coming from Inner Mongolia, China, very recently, now, the marmots, for example, in that area, the marmot population, they're small rodents, are infected with plague. And again, naturally not a problem for humans. But when humans, in certain parts of the world, marmot barbecue is considered a little delicacy. And so people eat marmots, or they catch the animal and whatnot. So during that process, they can contract the disease. So there are possibilities for humans to be infected. In fact, in the US, there is plague. I mean, we're not talking about huge epidemics. We're talking about what's called sporadic cases of human infection. Every year, about 10 to 15 cases of human plague, including some deaths, occur in the US as a result of plague. And this is mostly in the western and southwestern states. You have plague in Arizona, Colorado, New Mexico, California, Washington State, and all that. And if you get in touch with, or happen to find a dead squirrel, for example, don't touch it. So the fleas, in fact, that live on those rodents can jump into humans. So, but as let me underline the fact that normally it's not a threat to humans, but it can become epidemic, as it did in history. No longer a major public health threat because it can be treated with antibiotics. But of course, historically speaking, before the development of antibiotics, it was a huge problem for humanity. So again, another aspect of plague that is extremely different from COVID-19, and in fact, many other infectious diseases, very high mortality levels, all right? So we're talking about, on average, 30 to 60% mortality rate very, very high. And in fact, and again, when I say plague, I am talking about what is commonly understood as bubonic plague, inflammation of the lymph glands and fever and other symptoms. But these buboes form under the armpits and the neck area and the groin. So just something that would be extremely painful, swellings. But this is what's called the bubonic plague, and it is the default form of the disease. And 30 to 60% mortality is in this category, this form of disease. Normally not something that would be transmitted from human to human. So if one person is sick, that person will not infect other people. So, but plague has other forms. So the bacterium can infect the lungs in certain cases and cause a what's called pneumonic plague. It's a pneumonia-like condition. And in that case, it can be transmitted from person to person with extremely high mortality rates. If it's not treated, 100% mortality. And even with antibiotics, extremely lethal. So let's just, try to lay out the basics, the factual information. As I said, it's important to think about the disease's history. So, okay, we mentioned that it is it produces high mortality. And let me also say a few things about the biology of the disease with respect to its interaction with the environment. So plague is not something that you, in fact, for most zoonotic diseases, that is to say, the kinds of diseases that are transmitted from animals to humans. In fact, COVID is one example here. So was SARS, MERS, Zika, Ebola, most of the infectious diseases that we know. In fact, more than 75% of all infectious diseases have their original source in animals, and plague is one of them. Now, for most of these zoonotic diseases, it's important to think about the wider ecological context, because under normal circumstances, these are bacteria and viruses that live in the animal population, right? But if we as humans don't interfere in the situation, the viruses or the bacteria will not necessarily kill them. They kind of, might cause problems, but normally it's not something that causes a big threat for other species, because over time these organisms, the animal organism and the pathogen, the disease bacterium or virus, just finds a balance, an evolutionary balance of just symbiosis of sorts, right? The problem starts when the virus or bacterium jumps into another species, and there is this problem like instability, as we see now. Coronavirus doesn't know with our bodies, and our bodies don't know what to do with it. We overreact, even like with healthy individuals, young individuals. We have this, because we have this immune response, we get sick and all that. So what I'm trying to say is that under normal circumstances, these disease-causing pathogens will stay where they are. But most of the time, it is because humans interact with their natural environment in a certain way that these diseases become a huge problem. This is what usually referred to as emerging infectious diseases, right? Most of the diseases we just mentioned, especially the most recent ones, Ebola, Zika, SARS, COVID, these are all emerging infectious diseases. Now, and plague, when it first emerged, was a disease like this. And a typical behavior for these diseases of those emerging infectious diseases, including plague, is that they kind of spread to a population, right? Affect a certain number of people in a given population, but after a while, they kind of recede, right? I mean, they don't disappear, but they're kind of like, they go in a dormant phase, for example. But then they later come back, right? We're now in the pandemic, we're not past that phase yet. We're not there yet, But with coronavirus, it's possible that, either the vaccine will be developed or people will develop herd immunity, and whenever that will happen, hypothetically, of course, but then the virus might recede, but then later on, like 10, 15 years, it might come back again. And again, I'm just, talking about a hypothetical scenario here, but this is kind of the typical behavior you expect from an emerging infectious disease. For that reason, we need to think of this model to understand past plagues, including plague, but other plague in general, just thinking about infectious diseases. Now, just having covered the basics of the biological aspects and the ecological aspects of the disease of plague, let me try to briefly mention the basics about its history. Right? What do we know about plague's history? So first of all, as I mentioned, the name of the virus, Ursinia Pestis, is one of the older bacteria that we know affecting human societies. We have now evidence that it was occurring in Western Eurasia as early as the late Bronze Age. In the 3rd, 4th millennium, we have BCE, we have evidence of Ursinia Pestis killing individuals. And how do we know this? Well, of course, we don't know this from historical sources. How do we know this? We know this from archaeological evidence. Now, it is possible, in fact, it has increasingly become possible to explore this using methods of bioarchaeology and paleogenetics. What archaeologists do basically just extract, try to extract the genetic material of this disease from human bones, especially teeth, human teeth. Why? Because the enamel of teeth still preserves, it works like a capsule, preserving parts of blood in the bloodstream, and the bacterium that is captured in the bloodstream at the time of the death of the individual can still be extracted. And now in the lab, the paleogeneticists can extract the genetic material of the bacterium, and then they can basically, if someone died as a result of plague, is now can be identified in the lab. So this is how we know that plague was affecting societies in the late Neolithic era and the Bronze Age. So this is all to say that plague has been with us for some time, right? In that sense, it's not COVID-19. It's not the first time human society is experienced. So it has a long and deep history. But of course, our historical knowledge of plague comes from historical eras when, in which human societies started leaving written records of it. So when we go back to the earliest historical records about plague, the first historically recorded human plague pandemic is what we know as the Justinianic Plague of the mid-6th to mid-8th century. This is a pandemic of plague, and we know for a fact that it was caused by Ursinia Pestis. So we are sure about that, again, for methods that I just mentioned through bioarchaeology and paleogenetics, extraction of the bacterium from human teeth. We know for a fact Justinianic Plague, we also call it the first pandemic, was a bacterium, was a pandemic of caused by bacterium Ursinia Pestis of plague. Right. So the first pandemic, we call it, it's not the first pandemic, but we call it the first pandemic because it's the first historically recorded pandemic. Starts in the middle of 6th century, 541, 542. Historical records tell us that it spread across the Mediterranean world, starting in the Eastern Mediterranean, then reaching from Egypt, then Eastern Mediterranean, and then Constantinople, the capital of the Byzantine Empire. It spread during the during the reign of Emperor Justinian, the Byzantine emperor, and that's why it was named after that. But again, like all emerging infectious diseases, there was the first wave, and then 10-20 years later, there's another wave of plague, another wave of plague. It continued for at least 2 centuries, as far as we know, right? So then there doesn't seem to be a big plague pandemic for a few centuries, or at least, we're still missing some pieces of the puzzle. But what we know is that in the middle of 14th century, there is another big plague pandemic. The Black Death, and of course, this is perhaps the most famous of all pandemics. Everyone knows about this one, and it's, for that reason, it's the most problematic one, because there's a lot of misinformation about it, and because it has, because now it's been studied by using these new archaeological and genetics methods, and now there is no new information about it. So let me now talk about the Black Death. This is the beginning of the second pandemic, right? And then I will move on to the third pandemic. Now, couple of things. So I'll start with the narrative that we have, and then hopefully we can think together about what's wrong with the second pandemic plague narratives, the Black Death narratives. And with that in view, I'll talk a little bit about the third pandemic. Then we can go back to think about the question of legacy. Now, the Black Death. We're in the middle of the 14th century, according to the usual narratives, according to usual historical record. And most of these narratives come from European sources. In fact, most of us who are not specialists on this topic think of the Black Death as a European phenomenon, right? This is how it is taught in schools. That's how textbooks are produced. And if you look at the Wikipedia page, and I was part of the colleagues who were part of this project were reporting that the Wikipedia page on the Black Death is one of the most popular entries, visiting 4 million hits every year, which is, of course, what you have on the Black Death on Wikipedia is very important. Yes, because people take it as the gospel. Well, and most of this narrative about the Black Death, and again, just it's very consistent, and it's almost everywhere. It is discussed as something that is exclusively European, right? Very Eurocentric in its focus. So the map that I am showing here, I hope you can see it. This is taken by from a book on the Black Death, in a book published around 2004, I believe, by historian Oleg Benedicto. And again, up to this point or so, and I think in the last 10-15 years, there's like no new research and things are changing, but I want to give you the classic narrative, right? But among the non-specialists, this is still how people think, right? So according to this, right, and this is a narrative that I am keeping a very close eye on in its development and whatnot. This is a narrative that starts in 1830s. So it's not a new narrative. It's not a new invention, right? It's a 19th century Eurocentric vision of history that kind of back projects to the 14th century, but it definitely situates Europe at the center of history and reads the entire history of the pandemic from a Eurocentric focus. According to this narrative, plague starts somewhere in the Caucasus area. And again, on the map, let me just show you or get your attention to areas that has no data, right? We don't know anything outside, well, there is Europe and there is a little bit of Anatolia, to be fair, and Mesopotamia, and I guess North Africa. But outside of it, well, what is going on, right? Was there no plague outside of this area? Was there no civilization? Was there no one living outside this area? And why would plague stop moving from one place to another? I mean, we're not talking about diseases that would respect human boundaries, right? Because primarily it's a rodent disease and animal disease. You know, if when animals move, you are going to have the movement of the disease. So this map, in the sense, of course, does not make sense. But let's stick with it for the time being to understand the narrative. So according to this narrative, plague starts somewhere in the Caucasus region north of the Caspian Sea, right? Then kind of shifts to the Black Sea. And again, the classic narrative, the siege of Kaffa and the catapulting of the soldiers, and the entire thing is, of course, a myth. Now we have new research that tells us that is absolutely not true. In fact, it relies on the testimony of a Florentine notary who actually was not even there during the siege. So we don't even have an eyewitness account. In any case, as new research is done, we are learning more and more about what part of the narrative was actually just false, right? Or what faults of it is just like missing, you know, how we can add to it. So, so again, according to the narrative, you have the disease breaking out in the port of the city of Kaffa, north of Black Sea, in the Genoese colony, and then being transported with ships first to the Byzantine capital of Constantinople, then spread. And again, if you take a look at the different colors showing the progression over time, the red area 1347, Constantinople and its surroundings, and then traveling across the Eastern Mediterranean ports, and you see there it's spread to the Cyprus, to Jerusalem, Damascus, Cairo, and then other North African cities, but then of course to Europe and the European ports of the Mediterranean. And again, classic story that it spread in southern Italy, Sicily, Messina, and then finding its way north. But we also know that it was spreading at the time in other parts of Eastern and Southern Europe. So, and again, the classic narrative is then it kind of moves north gradually, right? Reaches England in 1348, 49, affecting Scotland, 1350, and again, Germany and Northern Europe. And then again, according to the usual narrative, it kind of comes from the east, then goes west, then goes north, and then goes back east. And so kind of full circle. Right. So this is something that I discuss with my students a lot, just, you know, showing this map and just, you know, what's asking the question, what's wrong with this map, right? And of course, you know, as you can tell, probably, like, obviously, one thing that is obviously wrong with this is that, you know, there's only Europe and a little bit of the surroundings, and there is nothing else around it. And you might say, yes, you know, we need more research. And it's true, as we don't have the research to complement or to complicate the picture, it's, of course, it will remain as a Eurocentric projection. At the same time, there are other issues that, as we see, you know, arrows showing on maps as if, you know, we know exactly how it's spread from one place to another, right? And that's also a source of discussion. We don't know, right? What we know is these trajectories are basically the trajectories of how news spread, how one town basically told the other they had it. So we see the roots of information basically, rather than the news of the spread of rather than the spread of the infection. And at the same time, there are problematic areas, like, you know, if you see here, usually around Poland, you have this no data, this the missing piece of this entire, you know, infectious area And again, that's a problem of historiography and record keeping than a lack of infection. But there are other issues related, if you look at it in the big picture, and that is that it portrays the Black Death that happened in the middle of the 14th century as a static and a one-time phenomenon, right? It comes from the East and it completes full circle, goes back East, and then Europe is saved, right? I mean, of course, I'm reading a little too much into it. Okay, I guess a little too much into it in that picture. But the historical narrative that accompanies it, it makes an emphasis to the Black Death as a one-time event, like as a one-off, but not part of a long history. So I will go back to the longer history of plague in Afro-Eurasia, but let me just switch to this slide. Well, now that we have this map in front of us, and talk about the extent of the spread of the infection, right? So as I mentioned, you know, the map that we have from the middle of the 14th century showing only Europe and its surroundings for the Black Death, as if there is nothing else beyond it. What we have here on this map is basically a representation of the urban connectivity of the world in the mid-14th century, right? So all the little dots on the map that you see refer to basically urban areas, and the blue lines are the connections. I mean, trade routes, pilgrimage routes, the routes through which armies or travelers moved, right? These are connectivities. This is how connected the world was in the 14th century. And yet we want to think of plague only affecting one corner of the world, right? Of Afro-Eurasia, which is a much bigger world, but then history and historians looking at one little corner of it. What's wrong with it? Well, this is what's wrong with it, right? So I think as historians, I think we need to communicate and emphasize the idea that when we study the history of infectious diseases, when we study history of pandemics, let's have a big picture, right? I mean, if we were to study today only one little part of the world as if there is no infection anywhere else, we would be missing out a lot. Well, let's think, you know, let's think of the big picture. Here also, let me try to emphasize something. We're still in the mid-14th century. We're still in the age before oceanic trips and sailing across the ocean to the New World is still not a big reality, at least, you know, in the centuries after that as well. But because the transmission of the disease is still more or less limited to the old world, right? And perhaps there were like occasional, you know, spread to Southeast Asia and whatnot. We know more about this landmass, but connected. Africa and Asia and Europe, Eurasia, Afro-Eurasia disease zone. And historians have actually written about this. And we know that biologically speaking, they were sharing the same diseases. So in fact, if the world was disconnected in the 14th century, if people were going back and forth all the time, well, if they were carrying trade items and if people and travel animals and trade goods traveled, well, probably diseases traveled as well, right? So this is just to kind of get a sense of how connected the world was and how we think of how we should think of the diseases. In terms of going back to the question of time, definition of how long the history of plague was during the second pandemic. Well, as I said, the historical narrative that was built, that in fact started in the middle of the 19th century by European historians that talk about plague as something, or the Black Death as something that only affected European society, right? They not only created that Eurocentric narrative, but they also created this narrative as if the Black Death was a one-time event and excluding all the later outbreaks that came after it, right? So instead of looking at the long history of the pandemic, just focusing on the 14th century, of course, extremely problematic, and let's change this narrative and let's look at the long history of the disease. In fact, there is now new research that explores the pre-1347 outbreaks of the Black Death, and all these years we thought of the Black Death as, you know, starting 1347. Well, even that is wrong, as new research will soon reveal. And I know that there's a few projects in the works about this, probably a century earlier, like mid-13th century. But we only rely on the European records, and so we get only part of the picture, right? So I think as new research coming from the Islamicists will reveal mainly that, you know, 13th century was actually when the Black Death started. In any case, going back to the question of the long time frame, well, yes, the Black Death in the 14th century, as we know, according to the classic narrative, like 1346, 47 to 1353, couple of years, yes, but then it kind of, you know, goes away for a while. And in 1360s, you have another one. 1370s, you have another one. 1380s, and it continues like every 10, 15 years for a very long time, for a couple of centuries. When does it end? And again, that's a question now comes up a lot these days, right? When does a pandemic end? When do you know it ended, right? So the same question applies to historical discussions. And so when did the second pandemic end? When did the series of outbreaks? And again, if you ask historians of Europe, they will give you an exact date about when it ended. They will say, oh, the Great Plague of London was the last plague in England or in Northern Europe. Or if you look at Southern Europe, historians of France will tell you the plague of Marseille, 1720, was the last plague of the second pandemic. Well, if you're an historian of the Middle East or a historian of the Ottoman Empire like myself, and you look and, well, there's still plague after that date, and what do you do about it? So there are outbreaks of plague in the Ottoman Empire in the 18th century, and it continues into the 19th century. And in fact, my latest research showed that it continued even to the 20th century. So now, you know, I'm faced with the question of, well, we're talking about a disease that affected at least the Middle East, if not the wider area around it, for at least 600 years. And we're still talking about it as if it's something that only affected Europe, and as if it's all something that only lasted for a few years, right? So all of these questions of narrative are important and need to be revised. And why is this important? So, you know, why do I make such a big deal about, you know, oh, it's not only this place, well, I mean, if you expand the scope of both the temporal and the spatial scope of the disease, the narratives also change, and the legacy of the disease that I want to talk about. So let me just very briefly talk about what my research does and what my new research is trying to accomplish. But then I'll go back to the legacies. So, well, because I thought that narrative was wrong, and because I thought that narrative needed new information to complicate that narrative, I worked on the history of plague epidemics in the Ottoman Empire from the Black Death to the end of the 16th century in my first book. And what I realized was actually the circulation of the disease was much more complex than the narrative held. And the narrative, what did the narrative say? The narrative says it comes from the east and it goes west. So when you look at the history of Europe and reading historians of the early modern era writing about this disease, the history of the disease, it's a classic narrative that is repeated across the board. Plague comes from the Ottoman Empire. plague comes from Oriental landscapes. Why? Because those people are dirty. They don't understand the notion of contagion. They don't understand, anything about disease. They don't know how to protect themselves. They live in filthy circumstances. They don't understand anything about science. I mean, these are the classic staples of this narrative that is, extremely common to find in travelers' accounts, diplomatic records, medical writings across the board, everywhere. I mean, there is a consensus in Europe that the disease came from the Middle East, from the Islamic Middle East in particular. So in my book, I was trying to not only look at the genealogy of this narrative, like, where does this narrative come from? But at the same time, see if it was actually historically accurate. And in fact, it wasn't, right? So, so my research basically showed that it's not a straightforward east to west movement of the disease, and that actually it was a lot more complicated. In fact, in the period of especially in the after the Black Death, and for a century or more, plague came to the Ottoman Empire from Europe. European historians of Europe did not like it when I said this. I'm like, you're saying that it comes to Europe from the Ottoman Empire, where actually it's the reverse. Like, plague will start in places like Venice or Ragusa, in like southern Mediterranean port cities. I mean, southern European port cities. And it will move to the Ottoman Empire. So there's like, it's something that we can trace, right? But later on, the movement of the disease becomes more complex. It's not only east to west, but it's, east to west, west to east, north to south. So it's moving in all sorts of directions. As this map kind of at least shows the basic trajectories of the circulation of disease. So it's not a straightforward, it comes from the east narrative. And again, it's a narrative and nothing else. And it's a false one. So showing the kind of the accurate historical kind of circulation of the disease allowed me to tackle that narrative, right? So not only as something false, but if you have a narrative, then, well, it probably fulfills a role, right? There's a reason why you have such narratives. So I was looking into the development of these notions, like when does it develop, like what purpose does it serve, and all that. And in fact, I realized that it is the narrative itself was not something that developed in the very early period. It's not medieval, it's not 14th, 15th century. It is, well, let's just say the earliest examples of that kind of thinking of the Orient and the Muslims as sickly or as a source of disease. You can find traces of that line of thinking in late 16th or 17th century sources, but really it takes hold in the 18th century and is developed fully in the 19th century. So the colonial register, it really is something that amplifies as that. But really the Plague of Marseille is a turning point in the development of these narratives. And in the article that I assigned, I actually talk about why the Plague of Marseille is so important for the development of these narratives, because it seems as though that there are a few traces of this line of thinking circulating across Europe, more or less, or kind of scattered ideas about the East being the origin of disease. Really, the Plague of Marseille is when it is kind of solidifies and turns into a narrative, then circulates across Europe. Throughout the rest of the 18th century, this is something that you find in the writings of scholars, scientists, medical authors, and public health specialists, and other writers writing about the Orient as the sickly Orient. But let's for a moment also think about the political context of things, right? 18th century is not a time period in which the Ottoman Empire is a major military and political threat to Europe, right? It's, I think, significant that these narratives of the Ottoman Empire, especially in the 19th century, being framed as the sick man of Europe, right? This is, anyone who's worked on the diplomatic and political history of Europe in the 19th century in particular, probably will be familiar with the term sick man of Europe, right? So its political legitimacy is being just, delegitimized by referring to the empire in that sense. But it's, yes, in the political sense, it's the sick man of Europe, but at the same time, you see that it is a society that is rendered on the colonial register, at least, in the writings of these European scholars, as a society that is sickly, right? The body, the Oriental bodies, the disease, the filth. And again, this is, I cannot overemphasize this narrative in the sources. In fact, I call this epidemiological Orientalism. It's a mouthful, I get it, but I find it useful to think of this as a way of thinking about the Muslim Middle East as the place of sickness. Now, this is very important, and this is where I want to tie it to the third pandemic, and just checking the time at the same time to, we still have time, right? To the third pandemic and to East Asia and Latin America, because hopefully, as I will show, they're all connected. Now, in the 19th century, this narrative of the sickly Orient it's in full form, right? It's now deeply established in the European intellectual sphere, and even beyond the intellectuals is something that is just, how the public thinks about the East, the Middle East. But it's also interesting to there's something that I think I want to underline is that not only, the Middle East, but only the Muslims in the Middle East, right? We know that the Ottoman Empire did not only have Muslim population. An important number of Christian and Jewish minorities also lived in the empire. So it was not a Muslim empire per se, exclusively, but these European observers will come to the urban centers of the Ottoman Empire and say, no, only Muslims get sick, because Christians and Jews, well, more Christians than Jews in their accounts. They're not very partial, objective, let's say. Christians know how to protect themselves, right? But Muslims don't. Anyway, so it's very, very kind of, stereotypical accounts of the society. So the Muslim community, is very closely connected with this Oriental sickly individual, right? And again, it's not only about the body, it's not only about sickness, but you kind of, take away the power of these individuals, of the society in a way. It's kind of dehumanizing in some sense, right? So, right. So for a moment, I want to switch to somewhere far away from here. I want to take you to the plague of Hong Kong. It's a big leap, but why is it important? And why is it connected? So, as I said, since the early modern period, but especially after the plague of Marseille, 1720s, so throughout the course of the 18th century and the 19th century, public health specialists in Europe and medical authors are thinking about the Orient as a sickly place where they receive diseases from. And in the 19th century, especially as plague is not a major problem, cholera pandemics, really a major problem for the world. Starting in 1830s, cholera comes to Europe. It's devastating. It's a new disease. It just creates all sorts of, new public health policy and new regulations. And there is really an anxiety in Europe built around the idea of the protection of the boundaries and establishing more sanitary policies, sanitary rules. And in fact, this is the beginning of the establishment of an international effort to protect European population, European health coming from diseases. And again, at the time, the whole idea and that narrative about cholera, not plague, cholera comes from India. And again, it's very closely embedded in, especially British colonial narratives, but also other European colonial narratives feeding into this idea, like disease comes from the East, needs to protect itself, right? I mean, the entire focus is, protection of the population, but when you read carefully, what they really mean is this European population, protecting Europe, securing its boundaries. So you see, especially in the second half of the 19th century, the establishment of international efforts for international sanitary conferences. And in fact, these organizations lay the groundwork for the establishment of WHO, for an international effort beyond nation states, right? Trying to control global health issues and addressing pandemics. So when throughout the 19th century, you have repeated outbreaks of cholera pandemics affecting Europe and other parts of the world, and you see this organized effort. But at the same time, in the back of the mind of the colonial officials and public health officials and medical specialists in Europe, when they go to, when they're in India, in different parts of, East Asia, South Asia, observing the disease, what they really have in mind is the stereotypes of the epidemiological Orientalism that they, developed in the Ottoman lab of plague, right? I believe those legacies, those long-lasting legacies are very important. And on top of this, in 1894, you have a plague in Hong Kong. This is the plague in which I referred to in the beginning of my talk. The French bacteriologist, Alexander Yersin, is the one who isolated the bacterium. So that's, when it happens. And of course, this is the age of the height of the microbiology. Bacteriology is a field that is developing around this time. Pasteur, Koch, and all these figures in Europe training their students, and all these scientists ending up in Hong Kong, like basically competing with each other to isolate the bacterium first, and Yersin does it. Now, Plague of Hong Kong is another very important turning point. Why? This is what we call the third pandemic. In fact, when you look at the genetic definition of the bacterium, the lineage of the bacterium that caused the plague of Hong Kong, it is not a different pandemic. It is actually related to the second pandemic, to the Black Death, right? But because the European colonial register saw it as a separate pandemic, that still today is something that we think of it as the third pandemic, as an independent pandemic. Why is this important? Because 1894, now you have a different kind of technology that, diseases can use to travel the world. There are steamship technology and railroads. In fact, it's possible now for a disease to travel across the globe in very short periods of time. In fact, as a result of the new transportation technologies, plague spreads very fast. Within 10 years, it's everywhere in the world. This is where it comes to San Francisco. This is where it comes to Latin America. This is when it goes to Australia, and everywhere in the world. 1894, you have the spread of plague. And again, in the beginning of my talk, as I said, there are certain parts of the world where you still have the disease. Well, that transmission happens after 1894. So that's why Plague of Hong Kong is very important. Now, in 1894, and in the years after that, what is called the third pandemic, when this was happening, the colonial agents, public health officials, and medical doctors working on site in East Asia, in South Asia, because so spread to India and other parts of Asia, thought about the disease exactly in the terms that they thought about the Muslim Orientals. Some like dehumanizing description of those bodies. And suddenly the bodies in Hong Kong are exactly the same as the bodies in the Muslim Middle East. That notion of the Orient, it is so flexible. Like, as long as you're not a European body, I guess, like anywhere between Istanbul and Hong Kong would be Oriental, right? And so it is very significant, at least to me, to see how the tropes and metaphors and stereotypes talking about the plague in the Middle East kind of could be applied across time at the end of the 19th or beginning of the 20th century to those in East Asia, South Asia, anywhere where you have the colonial register. This is how I think is can be related to thinking about Latin America in this context. I'll talk briefly about that. So during the third pandemic, we see that plague arrives in the port cities of Latin America and kind of starts spreading inland. And we still have, in Latin America and South America, we still have cases of plague. Not epidemic, but occasionally you will see cases of human infection. And I think it is still interesting to think of how that colonial discourse of thinking about the Oriental bodies was directly applied to the case of Latin America, and how those Oriental bodies, again, dehumanizing and kind of portraying them as sickly individuals and all that. I think the same discourse applies in that context. And again, I'm not a specialist of the third pandemic or of Latin America, but I think to me, at least, those similarities are striking, right? The way they are talked about, and the element of how those Oriental bodies are like dehumanizing in a way. And so I think I will wrap up quickly as I'm running out of time, right? So just very quickly, I want to say something about this new research that I promised that I would talk about the biological legacy of disease. As I said, there are all forms of legacy of pandemics, and who knows what legacy that we will leave behind after COVID-19. But if we want to think about plague, the cultural legacy, I think one of the lasting cultural legacies was this epidemiological Orientalism. You can call it something else, but it's just, depicting the other as something less than human, as a source of disease, and blaming those individuals for being, for causing the disease and for spreading the disease. In fact, we in the early days of the pandemic, we saw Trump making saying Chinese virus, right? I mean, all those, I think, are very closely connected to the lasting legacy of older pandemics. That Oriental theme, I think, is still valid today. So, but that is more like the cultural legacy of the disease. And if we want to think about the biological legacy of plague, and again, it's a very cool research. I just very briefly want to mention it, and I'll stop it there. Just about 2 weeks ago, there was new research that was published working with Middle Eastern individuals, mostly individuals, Turkish, Arab, Jewish, and Armenian individuals. There is a kind of a not super rare, but like less than 1% prevalence, the disease in the Eastern Mediterranean called familial Mediterranean fever, FMF. Again, it's not super common. It's less than 1%. And now they found that this was a disease, a genetic disease that developed to protect people from plague. I thought it was super cool to think of, to see a genetic marker of the disease. I mean, if anyone is familiar here with malaria and sickle cell, I mean, that's the same thing, right? Sickle cell, something that develops as a response to disease. And this disease, FMF, familial Mediterranean fever, is something that developed in this part of the world to protect people from plague. I mean, the disease itself is not great either, but at least historically speaking, it provided some protection of those individuals from plague. And it is one of the living legacies of the disease. Well, the disease is not there anymore, but I mean, plague is not there, but the other one still is. Okay, I will stop here and then we can switch to Q&A after here, right?
Yep.
Okay.
Yes, thank you so much, Professor Varlick. That was just awesome. Really, really great background, great maps, great resources, great content. Thank you so much. Let's give her our applaud reactions.
Just a quick reminder, I place this in the chat again, but for Nuket, I'm moderating the Q&A. Folks may raise their hand and we can unmute them. They can ask a question verbally. They can send a question in the chat to everyone, and I'm happy to read those questions. They may also send questions to myself directly if they'd like to ask a question anonymously. So I'll be reading those. Looks like we have one question in the chat from Katarina Kempf. She mentioned earlier that she teaches in Queens at the Bard High School Early College. She says, thank you for this explanation of epidemiological,
Yeah, I know. I feel the same. It takes a lot of practice, yes.
You've expanded my knowledge and understanding of the Bubonic Plague. I was wondering if you could talk more about how you've observed this narrative in regards to COVID-19.
Right, a great question. And I just, very briefly touched upon it toward the end of my talk. I mean, again, it's very relevant, at least to me. It is fascinating to see the continuities. I mean, when Trump said Chinese virus, that was the first thing on my mind, because, I mean, of course, I'm not going to reduce everything to history. Of course, there is a political context to it. I mean, I'm not going to deny, but at the same time, that the long-lasting cultural legacy of how to think about past pandemics, well, I think it is there, right? It's it is a discourse. You can borrow pieces from it. You can mix with something else, but it is there, right? I mean, it is something that comes up over and over and over again. And we can also think about how we create our own epidemiological narratives today, right? So let me just, we can't do direct question and answer dialogue, so I get to speak. I would love to ask questions, and maybe we'll do more of that on a Monday. But so in the early days of the pandemic, and I'm thinking of January, February, before it came, or at least before it the news in the US. Do you remember how news coming from China and how we were talking about it? At least, I was teaching a course on plague and pandemics this semester. I was, discussing this with my students, all the time. And my students were under the impression that, oh, it will never get here. It is something that only affects other people. It's something that is, us and them, right? It's it's their problem. It's not our problem. Well, I mean, let me tell you something. If there is an airborne virus, it's everybody's problem. So I was just, I spent a lot of time in that class there telling my students, this is really dangerous. We need to be mindful of, how we talk about it, how we think about it. And they quickly got on board with the idea of how this was dangerous. And then even before the World Health Organization declared a pandemic, we declared it as a pandemic in my class, and period, this is a pandemic, be careful about it. And my students were telling me, I converted them. So, but then they were talking to their parents or, friends and whatnot. And their friends and family thought that, they were paranoid, that they were just, being weird about it and all that. And they were so frustrated because, I mean, of course, when the society doesn't have, the relevant information, it's an effort to educate the public in that sense. And I think it is, I mean, I was really proud of my students to actually, really watching it in the beginning of since the beginning of the pandemic and being updated about it and being actually, mindful of the fact that this is not something that affects other people only. This is our problem, right? It's a global problem. So in that sense, right, we also saw how those narratives played out in the early days of the pandemic. And again, just, these emerging infectious diseases, they affect the world all the time. I don't know how many of you follow this, I know that I am a little weird, and just I get notifications from International Society of Infectious Diseases, so I know like all the diseases that are going on. Yeah, my family members really tease me all the time. I'm like, oh, there's this case of like this weird infection in Cambodia. Anyway, so but in Africa, there's still Ebola pandemic going on, if anyone's following, right? And measles really just being a big pandemic that they're dealing with. And in different parts of the world, they're like, these infectious, emerging infectious diseases happening all the time, except that Ebola is not as contagious as coronavirus. I mean, anything that is airborne is extremely dangerous. And at the same time, COVID has all the necessary components to make it into an ideal candidate to be a pandemic. But I guess, going back to the narratives, right? I mean, we are at fault as much as our historical actors are in thinking of this as, it is not my problem, it is somebody else's problem, right? It's a global phenomenon. And, yeah. It was a long way of answering that question, but yeah. So.
Well, this next question I think feeds right into that last point. Annie Grunewald asks, she thanks you for an amazing seminar. She asks how historians, academics, and other folks in the Middle East and the Far East responded to the notion of Europeans winning against the disease and then placing blame. And likewise, what has the reaction been within Europe to the new research that has come out, kind of overturning these old narratives?
Yeah, thank you for that question, because I know I didn't talk about it as much as I should have. Well, when can you blame somebody else? You can only blame somebody else when you think that you're better, basically, right? And that's exactly what happens when you look at history of plague in Europe. So after a while, I mean, it's not really as a clear-cut boundary as like the Great Plague of London, Great Plague of Marseille, but it is true that gradually plague disappears from Europe, though it still continues in the Middle East. So historically speaking, they had all the right circumstances to make that argument, except that it also corresponded to the time of European supremacy, politically, socially, economically, intellectually, to basically making the claims that we're the center of the world, we rule the world, we write history, this is what we're. But at the same time, when you look at medicine and how plague stopped being a public health problem in Europe, the entire historiography really centers around the idea that Europe successfully defeated plague, right? It's a very triumphalist narrative. And it's one that, I have to be honest, it drives me crazy because, I'm not, of course, blaming 18th, 19th century historians to think that way, but it continues today. Modern historians of Europe repeating this narrative, not realizing this is a narrative, right? We need to be aware that this is a narrative, and we need to acknowledge it as such. And we kind of need to distance ourselves from the narrative of our historical actors when they just repeat this as a fact, right? This is, when I get angry. So in any case, so what you have in the scholarship is that because European port cities and other cities later on developed quarantines and isolation of sick individuals and quarantine plague hospitals and whatnot, these measures that, aim to limit, if not really mitigate in the sense we understand today, at least limit the possibility of the spread of the infection, they want to think of European effort, public health effort, as successful to defeat the disease. This is entirely ahistorical. You cannot stop the movement of plague. If it is in the rodent population, your quarantine in the port city maybe will help, 5%, right? It will not stop the disease. So it is a huge problem, as I see. as, in a way that we are today looking at it and kind of, making this projecting into the past. So this teleological kind of, perspective just really, I think, is a very, very serious problem. Plague is not a disease that you can eradicate. If so, I mean, we wouldn't have plague in the US today, right? As having the most advanced public health system in the world, though I'll put a question mark to the end of it, as we know. We're having problems in that front. In any case, so what I'm trying to say is that plague, if it is in the natural environment, if it's in the rodent population, if it's in the marmots, if in the squirrel population, right? If it's in the prairie dogs as the host species in the US mainly, it's not something that you can control by putting up barriers in the natural, in cities, right? If it is in the rat population, your human boundaries will not help because it's not a human disease, right? So all these reasons, I think, are important to think about, like, how we interpret the past, right? Are we gonna repeat the same narrative? So that European triumphalist narrative is something to be mindful of, because Europe did not defeat the plague. That's a myth, right? But plague ended. Now, my second book project is basically to answer that question. Like, why did plague end then in Western Eurasia? It did end, right? That we know. I mean, perhaps it's a break, it's a pause. Maybe it's taking a break. Maybe it will come back. I hope not. But, well, we have antibiotics, So anyway, if it ended, if it was the end of a pandemic, why did it happen? And I think it has something to do with the extinction of the wild rodents that were the carriers of the disease, right? And I'm switching the question from a human-centric narrative to like multi-species historical narrative to understand, well, what happened to these rodents? Did they disappear because humans were interfering with their natural habitat, deforestation, building of expansion of new cities? I mean, in a way similar to what we see today in South, in East and Southeast Asia in particular. Again, I know that this is not really in response to that question, but I'll say this anyway. I mean, part of the stereotype today is like, oh, why do all these diseases come from China? I'm sure you've heard this over and over again. In fact, one of my classes, and one of my students said, oh yeah, it's because they eat bat soup. I mean, just, I think we've heard, all of us, we've heard that, right? But it is true that we have a number of new infectious diseases, zoonotic infectious diseases coming from that part of the world, right? But that is also related to fast urban expansion and the eradication of habitats of animals, and also the wet market and the meat trade slaughterhouses apparently is a dream place for the coronavirus. And so, where different species are very close together, I mean, those factors affect emerging infectious diseases. So back to my question, so that's what I'm trying to understand, right? That, urbanization or any other kind of intervention in the natural environment, some ecological crisis, some climate issues or other ecological crises were the cause for the disappearance of disease. I am not convinced by the quarantine, or other human intervention being basically the reason for the eradication of disease, plague, but I think it's more complex. So that's what I'm working on now.
Wonderful. Next question comes from Jennifer Dykes, who teaches at the Clinton School in New York City. She's curious what you might know about the history of plague along the Silk Road and in China. If the plague did move from animals to humans in the Caucasus region, then wouldn't the disease have moved east along the Silk Road? And how long did it take for plague to be recorded in China, if you know?
Right, that's still a kind of a controversial issue. We have different opinions about this, and I'll summarize what we know from the research of the scholars specializing on this. But let me just say that it's still controversial, right? And it probably, again, we want to think of it as east to west. Why, right? because of the narratives, right? We want to think that it comes from China along the, like, and does the virus or does the bacterium know that it's like, I have to go west, right? I mean, it's just, it doesn't make sense historically, right? But that's how we think about it because of the narratives, right? But Silk, again, that in itself is more of a construct than historical reality. Maybe there are multiple Silk Roads that, you know, branches or parts of the Silk Road or a system of roads that kind of, you know, they worked in conjunction with each other over time. Parts of it became more active, other parts becoming less active, because we can see this over time. The establishment of the Mongol Empire probably is an important factor in this regard. I think, you know, not to put the blame on like the Mongols brought the disease, that kind of, that line, that's not, I'm trying to move away from those stereotypes, but I think the establishment of a new imperial structure that provided a new form of connectivity across Asia is probably an important factor, you know, in this new emergence of a new pandemic. And that also is a reason why we think of the initial start of the second pandemic, not in the 14th century, but in the 13th century. And again, this research will be available soon. It's not available yet, so I can't really talk about it publicly, but at least I can talk about the research that was published a couple of years ago coming from Western China and Mongolia, more or less, and then how that connects to the Asian networks of the map that I showed, you know, showing the connectivity, right, in the 14th century. So we have, you know, not only the establishment of the Mongol Empire, but also migrations being a huge issue, like populations being displaced as a result of the emergence of this new imperial entity. So when you have humans moving from one place to another, what does it do? It puts new ecological strain on a new environment. So when people move, they're in need of looking for new food sources, right? And sometimes small rodents might just provide the protein that you need, right? But what happens when you deplete the population of the rodents, and then the fleas will jump onto humans? As I said, if you don't do anything, they will not jump on you, right? They are in a state of balance. So whenever you have high human mobility, or you have high, you know, human concentration, the increased population and population spilling over, people are looking for like new sources of food. Those are the circumstances in which we should think of the emergence of disease. That's kind of was a long-winded way of, in a way, of just, you know, addressing that question that we don't know for sure. We will know more, but it's not a straightforward line of linear, like east-west spread, right? Research suggests that it was the homeland, the so-called homeland of plague, is probably somewhere around today's modern Kyrgyzstan, around bordering China, the Tian Shan mountain series, or the foothills of the mountain series, are probably that area, right? Then circulating and emanating like to east, to south, to west, right? Not east to west only, but multiple directions. So let's think of it as it's more dynamic, it's more complicated, it's not simple. But yes, we'll learn more about it soon, hopefully.
This question kind of piggybacks, I think, on that quite nicely. Deanna Jones asked about the slide that you had, I think, that showed all of like the networks. You know, she was surprised to see a high density of movement in Europe as compared with Africa and Asia. You know, is this accurate, or is it a result of the research or records? You know, is it what we know, or is it, you know, some other reason why, you know, the density is so high in Europe?
Right. I mean, okay, that research, I don't know if, well, anyway, it's not a map of plague, just to you know, clarify once again, it's a connectivity of urban areas. So if you have more urban population, more urban centers, And if they're closely connected, then, you know, it will show as more dense. And it is true that Europe, you know, was on its way of becoming a more of an urban population already in the 14th century. But at the same time, let's just step, you know, away from Europe and think about Africa for a moment in the 14th century, because I think it's important. So until very recently, you know, most of us thought that, oh, the Black Death ended up, you know, affecting a few places on North Africa, right? The Mediterranean coast of Africa. There is plague, a mention of plague in Egypt and North African coast, but, you know, anywhere other than North African coast in the entire African continent was a mystery. Nobody actually knew when plague got to Africa. And, you know, people speculated that it was a much later phenomenon, like, you know, even like more into the modern period, 19th century. And, but you still have, you know, some of the oldest genetic lineages of plague in Africa. Like, how did that happen? At some point, it must have gotten there. So, but we don't have historical records, and it's very challenging in terms of research, like methodologically speaking, right? And, but archaeologists digging in sub-Saharan Africa and West Africa recently revealed that there is a very consistent pattern of abandonment of settlements starting in the middle of the 14th century. So they're digging, you know, finding this village that is abandoned, and then the next village is also abandoned, and carbon dating methods and whatnot, showing exactly around the same time as the Black Death was supposed to be occurring, you have all these abandoned settlements. I mean, of course, this does not prove that there was, you know, it was the Black Death plague in that region, but it is one of the possibilities. And in fact, there is additional now evidence coming from other parts of Africa, folklore, beliefs, songs, and, you know, religious practices now kind of, you know, supporting that argument that Black Death probably did reach sub-Saharan Africa as well. I mean, we have yet to see more of that research, but again, just to underline, we still know so little. And why is it like that? I mean, even the genetic research that I mentioned, the, you know, extraction of the bacterium ancient DNA from human teeth, almost entirely from Europe, right? I mean, we should, if we're talking about a pandemic that affected all those places, right, that we, you know, think that it traveled all those places, why is it only that we know about what happened in Europe? And so, you know, we need more bioarchaeological research coming from these places. And again, we're only now kind of putting the pieces together and learning more about Africa. I think that densely connected area is true, and for Europe and Anatolia especially, and probably just showing, you know, trade connections, you know, how those urban centers were connected to each other. But I think that it's still significant enough to pay attention to the connectivity that, you know, connects it to the rest of Afro-Eurasia.
All right, I think we have time for one more question, and then we have some business to take care of it at the end of our session, so we can wrap by 4:30. So Mustafa Hassan asks, during the Mamluk period in Egypt and the Levant, before the Ottoman victories there, was there any record of transmitting plagues from between Venice and Egypt and the Mediterranean ports, presumably 14th century, 15th century, something like this?
Right. Mamluk Egypt is one of the best known plague experiences in the Islamic world because of the record keeping of the time. We have detailed historical accounts and chronicles coming from Mamluk Egypt and Syria as well during the Black Death. Some of the most important plague chronicles and plague treatises composed by Muslim scholars at the time have been written in that time period in Mamluk Egypt and Syria in the middle of 14th century, in the later period. So we know relatively well about what happened. In fact, Mamluk Egypt is probably, at least in my research so far I can see, probably the first for record keeping in terms of the daily death toll of individuals dying during the plague, the Black Death. And this is way before anything that happens in Europe in terms of record keeping, systematic record keeping. We're talking about counting the dead bodies every day, right? And of course, you know, for tax purposes and whatnot, but, you know, Mamluk state is keeping those records. We also know, like in extreme detail, about not only how many people died, but also where they were buried, the daily kind of shifts and movements of the behavior of the disease, what people did, what the Mamluk government did to contain the disease and whatnot. So I guess I'm trying to say that Mamluk Egypt and Syria is really well documented. In terms of the transmission directly between Venice and Egypt, that is more of a question, I think, though surely, I mean, you know, because of the connection, there is something to be said about that. But I think I would also add to that picture the connection of Mamluk Egypt, especially with the Golden Horde in Crimea, right? And Venetian and Genoese, you know, shipping, trading, of course, you know, were very important in international trade in the Eastern Mediterranean before the Black Death, but then continued after the Black Death. But one of the most important staples of trade was slave trade. And slave supplies of slaves coming from the Golden Horde, and of course supplied with new enlisted slaves to serve in the Mamluk army. It was, you know, slave soldiers, I should say. And this kind of slavery in the Islamic world is slightly different from the Atlantic slave trade. But in any case, you know, Mamluk Egypt and Syria was one of the main recipients of that slave trade coming from the Golden Horde. And so that's also important to understand the movement of plague in the Eastern Mediterranean. So Mamluk Egypt is extremely important. And one last thing about it is that it never recovered fully from plague, from the Black Death. And that is probably why it was later on eliminated by the Ottomans. So there was a recent study comparing the effects of the Black Death in Mamluk Egypt and England, looking at two places as a comparative study of the effects of the Black Death. And in Egypt, a very important, you know, unlike England, the agricultural system of Egypt relied heavily on manpower, on individuals who maintain the irrigation systems, because when you don't have enough people to maintain those systems, they can be corrupted easily and, you know, not function, right? And of course, that's something in the long term that will contribute to less agricultural production and decline in population, combined with recurring outbreaks of plague. So it seems Egypt never recovered from the plague in the way that England could, because its agricultural system did not so heavily rely on intensive agricultural labor, right? So that's a difference. So in Egypt, we see a steady decline in population. And by the time the Ottomans, you know, did their campaign to Syria and Egypt, 1516, 1517, it was not even a huge problem to, like, militarily speaking, to conquer that area.
Wonderful. That's fascinating. Nukat, thank you so much. This was such a rich presentation. I'm really glad that you've started us off, with the historical perspective here.